People's Platform.
Good evening and welcome to the People's Platform. For the Newsfirst team, I'm Niresh. Well, exactly 3 weeks from now, 21 days to go, and Sri Lankans will be voting in the most crucial election in our country's history. Why is it so crucial? Because of what's been going on over the last several years, the amazing, incredible story of bankruptcy and hardship, how Sri Lanka has started to recover, but so many of the people are not in a good position. And how will people vote? We don't know. Okay, your guess is as good as mine, and what people say differs. But let's try to understand how Sri Lankans feel. What has happened to them psychologically through this traumatic period? What has changed in society? Is it for the good or the bad? And that's difficult to quantify. But we had some inkling of it this week when we were apprised of a survey, a survey which was carried out throughout Asian countries, 17 Asian countries, and it was carried out by the Center for Asian Philanthropy and Society, CAPS, which is based in Hong Kong. And in that survey, which is called the Doing Good survey, it turned out that we have as a society become a little better in this doing good or philanthropy. And to tell us a little more about it and explain the rationale behind all of this, we have with us Mr. Kithmina Hewage, Senior Advisor of the Center for Asian Philanthropy and Society, CAPS. Welcome, Kithmina.
Thank you, Niresh. Thank you for having me.
So tell us about this particular Doing Good survey, which is, I understand, carried out every 2 years. From what I read, you have 4 brackets. So let's just say 1, 2, 3, 4. The 4th is the worst, the 1st is the best. And Sri Lanka has well, we were in the 4th position in 2022, in the 4th bracket, and now we have moved to the 3rd, which is good news in terms of philanthropy and doing good in society. So would you like to explain how this is done and categorized?
Sure. So the Center for Asian Philanthropy and Society is a research and advisory organization, as you said, based in Hong Kong, and we work across 18 Asian economies. And the Doing Good Index is our flagship publication. So the index is published every 2 years, and we look at 4 sub-indices. And so it's regulations, tax and fiscal policy, procurement, and ecosystem. And under these sub-indices, this year we also added a chapter on digital technology use. So what we do is we survey non-profits and social enterprises in these 17 economies. We also consult experts across these 17 economies, and then we create the index. As you mentioned, we have 4 categories based on the performance in this index, moving up from not doing well, so not doing enough, which is the 4th category, as you mentioned, and then the doing okay, doing better, and then doing well. At the top end of it, at the doing well in category, we have Chinese Taipei, Taiwan, and Singapore at the top. In the 4th category, we have Bangladesh. Sri Lanka currently sits in the 3rd category, which is the doing okay category. We were in the 4th category 2 years ago in the 2022 iteration of this index, and we moved up this year. We can discuss the reasons for that and others, but so that's a broad perspective on what this index is.
To put it in perspective, in 2020, that's 2020, we were in the third category, and then in 2022 we plunged to the worst category, so it was Sri Lanka and Bangladesh.
Yes.
And now in 2024 we have climbed back into the third category. However, in 2018, when this index came out for the first time, we were actually in the second category, weren't we? So we had 4 years of going downwards, and now we it's a welcome sign that we have climbed up. But what would be the reasons for for going downwards and then for climbing back up? You mentioned the various aspects which are considered, but in terms of Sri Lanka, what did you all find?
So when we look at Sri Lanka is very sensitive to the economic and political events that happen. So if you think back to 2018, the political ecosystem and the economic ecosystem were quite different from 2020 onwards in Sri Lanka. So at the time, the general perceptions of how easy it is for the social sector to operate and how well the social sector, whether it's non-profits or social enterprises, to do their work and to serve the communities in Sri Lanka were seen as quite positive in 2018. In 2020, due to certain economic regulatory changes, we saw Sri Lanka drop, particularly in terms of the government support and tax support, for example, for the social sector. And then in 2022, it was mainly related to ecosystem issues. This is partly due to COVID. So there was a lot more pessimism around the social sector during COVID, even though the services provided by the social sector at the time had increased. So we saw this twofold trend of where the social sector was playing a bigger role in 2022 during COVID, but at the same time there was a high level of pessimism due to kind of political and economic regulatory factors that were going on. Now, during the past 2 years, the good news is that we have kind of turned the curve, and we've seen Sri Lanka improve. This is twofold. One is there has been a clarification of regulations by the NGO Secretariat. So as a result, that has made it easier for the social sector organizations to adhere to these laws and to understand the laws. And at the same time, the ecosystem around how they operate in terms of funding and hiring and so on has improved as well. So that has led to the improvement, but we are still in the third category. And of course, we have a lot more to do to improve and go up to the first.
Right. And your survey was carried out across, I think, 90 organizations, social. How do you term those organizations?
So we term them as social delivery organizations, and this includes non-profits as well as social enterprises. And our partner in Sri Lanka is the Institute of Policy Studies of Sri Lanka, the IPS. And we surveyed 90 organizations around the country in Sri Lanka. Across the region, in total, we surveyed over 2,100 for the entire index.
So that's quite a massive effort.
Yes, indeed.
Across
and
17 countries.
Absolutely, and we are very grateful for our local partners like IPS.
Right. Now, when Sri Lanka plunged to the last position, the fourth category, 2 years ago, as a Sri Lankan, how did you feel?
It was an interesting experience because I hadn't joined CAPS at the time, but I was at IPS a few years before that, and I had helped with the survey at the time. So I always follow Sri Lanka's performance. It was quite concerning, but it revealed, I think, what was going on in the country overall. With COVID as well as certain other kind of regulatory changes happening, there was a concern about what the social sector's future could be at the time, particularly with, for example, changing the NGO secretariat from to different ministries, and so on. So overall, there was that pessimism, and I think that reflected in the index as well. But you know, Sri Lankans are always hopeful of making a good comeback. We've done it in cricket. We do it in other areas of Sri Lanka as well. So I was hopeful that in the future, with the right regulatory changes and with the right kind of other policy changes as well, Sri Lanka could move. So this shift upwards now this year is a very positive movement. But as I said earlier, we have a lot more to do.
What's the difference between countries which are in that first category, which are Chinese Taipei and Singapore in that first category, and then in the second category you have China, Hong Kong, Japan, South Korea, Malaysia and Philippines. What's the difference between them and, let's say, the third and fourth categories?
So I think one of the fundamental factors is government support for the social sector. So in Chinese Taipei or Singapore or even some of the other countries like Japan, Korea and so on, the government recognizes that the social sector has an important role to play in society. And we see this in Sri Lanka as well, right? Because governments can't afford everything. Governments can't provide welfare for everyone. And particularly in a developing country like Sri Lanka, where we have fiscal challenges, the governments can't afford, nor can they increase taxes, because that places a burden on society. So the social sector plays an important role in filling that gap of service provision. And in Chinese Taipei, in Taiwan, or Singapore and other countries, we see these governments, regardless of party, agree that the social sector has a role to play, and therefore they've set up a core group of policies that support the social sector organizations to get involved and engage in the activities. So we're in Chinese Taipei, within Japan, Korea, all democratic countries that have elections and governments changing, but some of the core policies that support the social sector have remained constant. And that then leads to this performance of the social sector developing trust with the government, developing trust with society, and importantly, developing trust with the private sector as well. The second aspect of this is the private sector and domestic giving. So Sri Lanka is heavily dependent on foreign funding to its social sector, whereas in these countries we see domestic giving at a much higher level from the private sector, but also individual philanthropy, but also the government has created policies that encourage that domestic funding sources, which allows for the social sector to have more sustainable means of finance. So they are not dependent on grants from international organizations. They know that there is a continuous stream of funding that comes, and as a result they can plan ahead and deliver their services for the most vulnerable and marginalized.
So the government's fostering of sentiment and spirit, let's say good vibes, if you were to describe it colloquially, that has a lot to do with this spirit of philanthropy, doesn't it?
Yes, absolutely. So in Asia in particular, government signaling is very important, whether it's to the community, whether it's to the private sector, because the role of the government is much more involved than, say, in the US, for example. The government support and government signal is important. So for example, if you look at Korea, they have a separate procurement policy that encourages government departments and the private sector to procure from social enterprises. So these are enterprises that, for example, hire people with disabilities, that support women who have faced domestic abuse, and so on, that create environmental impact in their countries. So these are the types of policies, in addition to kind of regulatory policies, additional policies that encourage social delivery organizations to be involved in the economy, to be involved in the social, in addressing social challenges.
So if you were to have a more hardline, conservative-minded government, you are less likely to see such progressive policies.
Yes, I think what we've seen, as I mentioned earlier, is Sri Lanka is quite sensitive to the political changes. So when governments criticize the social sector and for example, treat them as potential threats, that then creates a negative ecosystem overall. People don't want to join the social sector. Social sector organizations.
Isn't that a strange phenomenon? Do you find this in other countries? I haven't. In other countries, people are grateful for the help that can be given to them. And in Sri Lanka, the public are grateful, but very often we find that governments, for political purposes, start attacking or restricting social development organizations, questioning their sources of funding and so on, which seems very counterproductive. I mean, in my view, we should be questioning the sources of funding of the government of Sri Lanka, because who's buying all these bonds, we don't know, and finally we're in debt to all these unnamed people. But in the case of what Sri Lankans like to call NGOs, which is a bit of a misnomer, isn't it?
Yeah.
But the social development organizations, the funding sources are fairly transparent, isn't it?
Social delivery organizations, yes. So I won't get into the government funding part of your question, but in terms of social delivery organizations, absolutely. In terms of trust, there is a big trust deficit with the government and the social delivery organizations, and that's unfortunate, because we see that whether it was COVID or even during the economic crisis, when people were suffering, it was these social delivery organizations that stepped in to provide the welfare services that the government couldn't afford. And these SDOs, the social delivery organizations, have a big part to play, particularly in rural Sri Lanka, and also to support the low-income groups in Sri Lanka. So while the government was struggling for finances and couldn't provide even at times basic support, it was these organizations that were stepping in and providing some form of support for these families. So social delivery organizations play a very important role, and I think it's very important at the same time that the government recognizes that as well. Now, having said that, I think trust goes both ways. So it's also important for then these organizations to also be transparent about their funding sources, for example. So what we encourage is for these organizations, publish your annual reports regularly. So there's a requirement now to send your annual reports and audited finances to the NGO secretariat. So do that and create that first step of trust building. Publish them online, right? So fewer than, I think only 58% of organizations in Sri Lanka have a website. And in this day and age, having a website is like the first thing we do. I mean, when we see an organization in the news or whatever, we first just Google it to see what it is. So having a website creates more transparency about that organization. Publish your annual reports on that website and create that trust. So there are things that organizations also can do, but at the same time, there is a necessity for, regardless of political affiliation, for governments to recognize that the social sector plays a very important role and as a result facilitate their work.
What about the effect of taxation? Because now when times get tough, governments tend to levy new taxes all the time, and that goes across not just corporates but also other organizations. Does that have an effect on the spirit of doing good?
So we've seen that tax incentives can play a role in incentivizing more giving, and for example in Singapore provides a 250% tax concession for any philanthropic giving, individual or corporate. Now, of course, Sri Lankan government is not in a position to give that type of concession given our fiscal needs. But what it does is, regardless of the amount, it's a signal. The government is sending a signal that philanthropic giving by corporates, by the high earners in the country, is a good thing, and we encourage it. And also it creates a signal as to what types of organizations are trusted by the government, but also what types of areas are important to the government. So Sri Lanka has, there is a limit to how much the government provides in terms of tax concessions, but also it limits the areas in which these things can be given to. So for example, environmental organizations don't come under the tax concessions for giving. So they're limited to kind of things like elderly care, children's welfare and so on. So I think that type of signaling could work, but I agree that we need to balance the fiscal needs of the government as well. So tax concessions do play some role, but it is not the be-all and the end-all of it. There is a role that the government can play in developing that trust beyond tax as well. And I think for a country like Sri Lanka that has these fiscal challenges, we are better placed to kind of target those types of regulatory changes rather than necessarily kind of focus on giving the Singapore type 250% concessions.
But sometimes you have governments taking knee-jerk reactions. Government needs money and it looks around, oh, there's some money in this sector, let's levy an increased tax. I recall the tsunami of 2004 where there was an outpouring of funding and assistance for Sri Lanka and for other countries which were affected by the tsunami, and all of a sudden the government of Sri Lanka levied this massive tax, which I think it was something like 16%, which put off everybody, because why would you be giving millions of dollars to a country which is supposed to go to helping the needy, and then the government siphons off 16%. So it's the wrong signal, isn't it?
Yeah. And at the same time, I think also kind of from an economist perspective, just because the government doesn't have enough money doesn't mean that the government should just increase taxes all the time, because that has a knock-on effect on inflation, that has a knock-on effect on the burden on the people, the tax burden on the people. So what governments can do smartly is to strike that balance and to create then the incentives for the private sector to divert their capital more towards, also towards doing things like philanthropy, like CSR or sustainability, or even to do social enterprises, to encourage and promote more social enterprises, which will then create economic benefits to the country while balancing the government's needs as well.
Now, your survey was carried out across 17 countries, and we are in that third category. But if you take an average, Sri Lanka is still below the average, isn't it?
Yes.
And how far below are we? Is it a deplorable number, or I mean, did we just get into the second category, or are we into the third category, or are we close to getting into the second one?
So Sri Lanka's movements, as I said earlier, were instigated by the clarification of regulations by the NGO Secretariat. So that was a big move, change that happened, as well as the ecosystem changes. So Sri Lanka did move significantly in terms of that move into the third category. For it to improve further and go kind of reach beyond the Asian average or to the second category, there are more broader reforms that need to be made, whether it's to deal with government trust, whether it's to deal with things like procurement policy, or as we discussed earlier, tax and fiscal policy. And these are things that the government can look at from a macro perspective which will then move. So these are not undeliverable changes. These are regulatory and policy decisions that can then trigger a bigger move for Sri Lanka.
Right. We at Newsfirst are no strangers to giving a helping hand to the public, the needy people. Of course, we have our own Come at the movement, which we are very proud of. It's now the largest grassroots development initiative in the country, and we have carried it out through thick and thin, through economic collapse and so on. So we understand the many challenges where governments and funding and all that is concerned. Now we will cross over to a short commercial break and we'll be right back, so don't go away.
The People's Platform. Study abroad with Edlocate, the industry pioneers in international university student placements on 30th August at KCC Banquet Hall. Call us on 0766 269 093, note 812 2386 777. The annual Nallur Festival 2024. Join us at the Shakti TV Nallur live studio from the 30th of August to the 1st of September, and tune in to Shakti TV to witness live telecast of the Sapparam on the 31st of August from 5:30 p.m. and the Ther on the 1st of September from 6:30 a.m. Shakti TV, power of the nation. Study abroad with Edlocate, the industry pioneers in international university student placements on 30th August at KCC Banquet Hall. Call us on 0766 269 093, note 812 2386 777.
සිම්පත හරියට ලියාපදිංචි කරගෙන තියෙන්න ඕන. සමහර වෙලාවෙම දන්නෙත් නැහනේ.
මේ සිම්පත කොයිතරම් වැදගත්ද කියලා මේ දුරකථන පාවිච්චි කරන හැම දෙනාම දන්නේ නැහැ කියලා තමයි මම කියන්නේ.
මැයි වලින් පස්සේ ලොකු ගංවතුර තත්ත්වයක් එන්න නියමිතයි කියලා. කාලගුණ විද්‍යාඥයින් අනතුරු අංගවන පසුබිමක ඔබ කොයි විදිහටද මේ අපේ තෙත්බිම් සම්බන්ධයෙන් දකින්නේ?
කොළඹ නගරයේ තියෙන නාගරික තෙත්බිම් වලින් 21%ක් තියෙන නාගරික තෙත්බිම් වලින් වැසි ජලයෙන් 39%ක් රඳවා ගන්න බව.
දැන් විලත් නගරයේ කටයුතු කරන කට්ටිය දැන් එනවා පාලනය නගරයට. ඔතන මේ දන්න හැටි අපි ගත්තොත් අලවටුකොට එහෙම නැත්නම් කිඹුලවල ප්‍රදේශයේ අපිට තියෙනවා රැයට කෑම කඩ. ඉස්සර ඒක තිබ්බ කොහෙද? කොළඹ. දැන් ගොඩ දෙනෙක් මේ පැත්තට එන්න පටන් ගන්නවා. මොකද ඒගොල්ලන්ට අර කොළ පාට ගතිය, මේ තියෙන බ්‍රීස් එක කියන්නේ ඇඟට දැනෙන වෙනස අනිවාර්යෙන් දැනෙනවා.
ජාතික මෙහෙවර සතියේ දිනවල උදෑසන 11ට. Study abroad with Edlocate, the industry pioneers in international university student placements on 30th August at KCC Banquet Hall. Call us on 0766 269 093, note 812 2386 777. The People's Platform.
Welcome back to the People's Platform. We are in conversation with Kithmina Hewage, Senior Advisor for the Center for Asian Philanthropy and Society, CAPS. Kithmina, before the break, we discussed a wide range of matters, but I'd like to get into some specifics here. You mentioned that digital aspect which has been included in the latest survey, which was not there in previous surveys. Could you elaborate on that?
Yes, so during COVID we saw a lot of organizations do more things online, and so we included a few questions in the survey about digital technology and online use in the 2022 iteration. And given those findings, we thought it was important to kind of dive more deeply into the use of digital technology in the social sector across Asia. So we included a separate section, new section, to this year's survey.
Okay, that's interesting. Diving deeper into your survey, I see that where foreign funding is concerned, 57% of Sri Lankan SDOs receive foreign funding, but only 39% of SDOs across Asia are receiving foreign funding. What's the reason for Sri Lankan SDOs to be receiving significantly higher levels of foreign funding?
So this is, I think, a twofold thing. One is that there's a lack of domestic funding available. And these organizations, as a result, are dependent on foreign funding. So usually what we see is, as countries move from low income to middle income status and then upper income status, the percentage of organizations that rely on foreign funding will fall over the years, and then domestic funding will increase. Sri Lanka is somewhat of an outlier in this regard, where even though we moved into middle income status quite a few years back, we still rely heavily on foreign funding. So I think that speaks to what we were discussing earlier about the kind of the sensitivity of the sector to government messaging. So if domestic donors, corporates or individuals may feel hesitant to donate to social delivery organizations because they see that the government is not trustworthy of these organizations. So that is one of the factors. Our survey also revealed that most of the organizations found that another factor is that people tend to give directly to benefactors, communities, rather than through these organizations. So sometimes organizations or individuals may have their own initiatives which they give to rather than through some of these social delivery organizations. And the third factor, I think, particularly over the past 4 years, is that local citizens have had fewer resources to give
due to the country's
economic situation. So I think that is to be expected because of the economic crisis. Then people have less money to be giving to organizations. So that has had an impact as well.
And also, I'm making an educated guess here, but would the volatility of the rupee, the forex rate, also have something to do with it? Because if a person were giving 10,000 rupees a month, that's worth much less now than it was 3 or 4 years ago. So would that encourage or entice SDOs to look overseas where the funding would come in dollars or euros or something?
I think it doesn't affect domestic giving because I think 10,000 3 years ago is the same 10,000 domestically. But in terms of foreign funding, probably we haven't found kind of that relationship necessarily. But what we found is because of the economic crisis, there was a lot more foreign funders who are willing to give to Sri Lanka. I think this also, when you talk about foreign funding, it also includes Sri Lankans who live abroad. So what we call the diaspora, the Sri Lankan diaspora abroad has given a lot to these organizations to help communities in Sri Lanka. And this is something that I think governments should also be considerate about, because when we try to restrict foreign funding flows into Sri Lanka, it also restricts the ability of Sri Lankans living abroad to give back to their communities. And the countries in the index that are performing better than us, that is one aspect of it that they allow. They allow foreign funding flows to come in because they understand that all these economies have communities that live abroad, big diaspora communities, and as a result they give back to give back to their economy and to their communities.
Now, Kithmina, something rather startling that I found in your survey was that throughout Asia, 44% of SDOs receive some type of government grants. 44%, which is excellent, from their respective governments. But in Sri Lanka, only a mere 16% are receiving government grants. What's the rationale here?
I think this is to do with the economic crisis and the government not having adequate funds to provide as grants. So that, I think, is pretty clear cut as to why that was, which is why I spoke about kind of other policies that can then help. So example, procurement policies. So then the government is not giving a grant, but the government is buying a good or service from a social organization, right? So that then creates that funding source for the organization, but also creates the economic and addresses the economic challenge that the government is trying to address. So whether it's, help procuring small artisan, goods from a small social enterprise, for the tourism ministry, for example, that then creates the souvenirs that can be given. So that creates economic opportunities while also helping the social sector.
But again, I noticed where government procurement from SDOs is concerned, only 12% of Sri Lankan SDOs have any kind of goods or services procured by the government, whereas across Asia the level is 30%. So again, government isn't doing much business with this sector, not procuring their goods and services, which would of course be goods and services of the people.
Yes, so this is a policy, I think, reform that can be made quite easily and will then have a big impact on the sector as well. And I think overall then that creates those benefits that I spoke about earlier.
So you spoke about policies, but again, the likelihood of government consulting SDOs on policy formulation is again lower significantly in Sri Lanka than in the rest of Asia. I think the rest of Asia, 14% of SDOs are consulted in government policy consultation, whereas in Sri Lanka only 10%. So that's quite significant, isn't it? So again, it is indicative of an attitude issue of governments in Sri Lanka with regard to this sector.
So I think that's a mixed bag. So only 10% said that they were being consulted often, but 77% of Sri Lankan surveyed organizations said that they were at least sometimes being consulted. And this number overall had increased significantly from 2022.
So that's good.
So that is good. I think that kind of goes back to what I was speaking about, some of the measures that the NGO Secretariat has taken over the past 2 years to help improve that engagement. So that overall 87% of either often or sometimes has pretty much almost doubled from 2 years ago. So this is a very positive movement. But as you said, in terms of the often number alone, there is more room for improvement, and I think the NGO Secretariat also recognizes that.
Another statistic that I saw in your survey is where the government procurement process is concerned, the number of SDOs which say that the process is not transparent is 94%, and the number which says that it's difficult to access information is even higher, 98%. So there's an issue of transparency here, and it's not just for the SDO sector, but I presume for all sectors, this lack of transparency. What can be done to improve this in practical terms?
I think in practical terms, open procurement bidding and competitive bidding policies is very important. Having legislation that makes it a requirement for government organizations to procure competitively rather than kind of go through special procedures that could lead to corruption and a lack of transparent processes could lead to losses to the government and the public overall. So as you said, this is not just something that is particular to the social sector and social procurement, but more broadly speaking, I think procurement as a policy.
Interesting. But we've got a long way to go, obviously. Now let's look at individual donations, the spirit of giving among the people, which is a key factor where public sentiment is concerned, isn't it? Now, in the rest of Asia, I think it was something like 78% of SDOs reported low levels of individual giving, but in Sri Lanka it's high at 84%. Can we have your comments on this one?
As I said earlier, I think this relates back to the economic crisis quite significantly. So a lack of resources and also kind of the general the crisis ecosystem meant that I think domestic sources and funding sources were quite hampered significantly at the time. One thing I want to highlight is, I touched on it earlier, with regards to digital technology. I think when we think about giving, it's not just the money, but particularly I think when you talk about the private sector can also play a role in the services that it provides to the social sector. So for example, 71% of SDOs we surveyed said that they don't have or are unaware of a cybersecurity plan in their organization. Now this is concerning because in this day and age, with everything online and with all the data that is online, I think Sri Lanka is at the third highest targeted country in the world for cyber attacks. I read a study recently. So given all of this, it's important that these organizations are adequately prepared for the future of digital technology, and I think the private sector has a role to play there. So whether it's volunteering their IT professionals and making time for them to volunteer with these organizations and providing their services, or providing software or hardware that can support these organizations. So it's not just about giving money, it's also about other types of resources that can be given. So there are a range of means by which different stakeholders can support the social sector.
Now let's look at, now this is the 2024 edition of the survey. Looking forward to 2026, what could be done to push Sri Lanka into the second category once again, because it was in that second category in 2018. So it's not at all impossible, it's quite possible, but what do we need to do to get there?
So there are, I think, some fundamental factors. For example, government trust and trust building. So the positive movement thus far needs to continue. So whether regardless of the election results, changes in government, I hope that the governments that come in the future will continue to support the social sector and the regulations remain constant and are easy to access to the social sector. And then there are those other policy measures that we spoke about earlier, whether it's about taxes, whether it's about procurement or grants, where the government has a role to play and can provide that additional support for it. Then there are regulatory things like improving the flow of foreign funding and reducing the restrictions around it. So obviously you need to have the basic regulations around foreign funding, to ensure that there is security and so on, but to make it clear that the government does support the social sector and allow for particularly Sri Lankans abroad to contribute more to the community. And finally, then you have the ecosystem factors, and that signaling is important from whether it's the corporates or whether it's the government, that the social sector is an important stakeholder in our development journey, and as a result improving their support. So whether it's funding, whether it's other resources, or encouraging people to volunteer their time, encouraging people to join the labor force and in the social sector and employ. So retention of workers, for example, is a crucial challenge for this sector. So there's a variety of things that can be done better in Sri Lanka, and these are not undeliverable challenges. So I think if we do those even small things and policy changes, attitude changes, ecosystem changes, then that can lead Sri Lanka to the next stage.
Correct me if I'm wrong, a lot of this would depend on policy, in which case it's the understanding level of our politicians, of any politicians in any country, towards SDOs and that sector, which matters. Now, clearly in countries, in economies like Chinese Taipei and Singapore, which are at the #1 level, the policymakers do understand this. But in countries like Sri Lanka, do they really? Do they understand the impact that their actions, that their policies would have on this spirit of giving?
I think the revealed preferences show a gap in terms of the attitude towards the social sector. I think overall in history, across history, we've seen that the governments have treated the social sector with some skepticism, even though in reality on the ground these social sector organizations play a very important role in providing welfare services. So hopefully, I think particularly with kind of publications like the Doing Good Index and also the other work that is done by other organizations in Sri Lanka, hopefully these attitudes change, and evolve to recognize that good governance includes, and good government policy includes, supporting the social sector, and that then helps the communities that ultimately vote for them.
Now, Kithmina, you mentioned that your survey drew data from 90 SDOs in Sri Lanka. Now, what's the background of these SDOs? Are most of them Sri Lankan ones? Because we tend to think of NGO, foreign funded. This is the bogeyman created over decades by governments. What's the nature of the SDO in Sri Lanka?
These are a majority of them, and most of them are domestic organizations and are not branches of international organizations. These are established, registered under the NGO Secretariat, and it's a random sampling of these organizations based on, and so we kind of survey, have this random sample, and a vast majority of them are domestic organizations. We have only a handful amongst the 90 are actually branches of foreign organizations in Sri Lanka. So this is a true representation of the social sector in Sri Lanka.
And these 90 organizations, are they nationwide, including the plantation sector, the north and the east and so on?
Yes, so not all of them work across the country, but when it comes to the geographical spread, yes, so these are organizations that work in all the sectors and all the geographical areas in Sri Lanka.
Interesting. So a very comprehensive survey.
We try to be. It's been a challenge trying to get organizations to fill the survey in Sri Lanka because of the trust deficit, I think. So hopefully for the 2026 iteration, when IPS comes around, if anyone's watching, I hope they fill our survey for the Doing Good Index 2026.
And I'm afraid we are almost out of time, but my final question is, Kithmina, what's your message to policymakers and the SDOs which are watching, and also corporates and local people who would want to give? What's your message to them?
I think my message is very simple. The social sector has a very important role to play in the development future of Sri Lanka. We cannot rely on the government to deliver everything, and there is inevitably a gap between what the government can provide and what the needs are for the country, of the community. So for that gap to be filled, the social sector plays that important role, and to enable that and to facilitate that, the government as well as the private sector as well as other stakeholders have a role to play in supporting these organizations, whether it's through funding, whether it's through policy, whether it's through other resource allocations and general ecosystem support. In providing that support, the communities that we need to that are vulnerable and marginalized in this country can do better and will be served. And when we lift up the poorest and the most vulnerable, the country as a whole will develop more as well.
And of course, no matter who wins the election, it is important for the policies to continue and to be more encouraging.
Absolutely, yes.
Kithmina Hewage, Senior Advisor for the Center for Asian Philanthropy and Society, CAPS. Thank you very much for being with us this evening.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you to you at home for watching. Don't go away, the news is coming up next. Have a good night.